and Power Apps Community Super User. So the session that is going to from him is going to be on Azure Resource Manager and Power Automate. Stay tuned and just drop your questions in the chat. At the end of the session, Yash will be able to answer that. Up to you, Yash. Yash, you can start the session.
Yash?
Yep, here I am. Sorry about the delay.
No worries, buddy.
All right, so I'll just go ahead and start with the presentation now. I hope you all can see my screen.
Yes.
So welcome back, everybody. I hope it was a nice and a fruitful day for you guys, and I hope everybody learned something today. In this session, we'll be focusing on Azure Resource Manager and Power Automate, how we can leverage the Azure Resource Manager connector and perform actions on resources that we deploy in Azure, which are basically of the type Azure Resource Manager and support the ARM templates and can be invoked with the REST API of the ARM. A little bit about myself here, although that was a great introduction. Thank you, Jiva, for that. I'm Yash Agarwal. I'm working as a software developer here. And this is my Twitter handle that you can follow and reach out with any questions you might have. Also, this is my blog, bythedevs.com, where I like to blog about how we can expand the capabilities of the platform and do achieve more with that. So please feel free to visit and drop in suggestions based on my articles if I should try something new. And the QR code you're seeing over here on the screen is the one to my LinkedIn account. So if you wanted to get connected on LinkedIn, please do so by scanning the QR code. I think that was enough time for the introduction. So I'll go ahead and get started on what we will be doing on this session. So basically, the gist is Azure and Power Automate, and the focus is mainly towards the Azure Resource Manager. Before jumping into the Azure Resource Manager, I just wanted to go through a quick glance on what all Azure services that that Power Automate already supports right now. It's more than 30 connectors that it directly supports, and to the services or to the tools that there are no connectors, but you can access via API. You can always create app registrations in the Active Directory and then access them in Power Automate using either HTTP actions or creating custom connectors. Some of the important use cases or implementation scenarios that we are looking here at based on the Azure and uh, the Power Automate platform in entirety is managing resource deployments. One of the most important part where ARM templates play role is like infrastructure as a code, where you can code your deployment. Uh, the resource or the desired resource, you can code it as an ARM template and then pass it onto the deployment action and get started with the deployment. So that is one. Then the next one is manage virtual machines. So this has been a new addition to the Azure family of connectors in Power Automate, where you can directly perform actions on Azure virtual machines using Power Automate. And you can see the action here on the screen on the top row. And then there's one which is invoking cognitive service APIs. So importantly, using face APIs or using text analytics APIs, you can pass through your content coming from different data connectors or different actions, and then pass it through the API and get all the use the cognitive API. For example, let's say if it was a face API and you wanted to authenticate someone based on their facial recognition, so you could invoke the face API from Azure from the Power Automate actions and then pass the response to the further actions. Similarly, there is the text analytics API that you can use for sentimental analysis or changing or translating language and things like that. And then there is accessing event logs, application insights, and monitoring Azure resources. So you can create event-based flows where the flow gets triggered based on an event that occurs in Azure on an Azure resource. For example, if you're monitoring something and if it reaches a certain threshold, you can trigger a flow to create, let's say, a task in Azure Devops, such that the relevant team gets notified about it, and then send them an email stating that, okay, this resource or this particular threshold was reached, and therefore this alert is being sent out, and the team needs to take certain actions on that, and that can be taken and carried forward that way. And then there is Key Vault Access, one of the, again, cool features of Azure, where you can create usernames and passwords. So for example, if there were actions and there were services or tools that there's no direct connector to, in Power Automate, and you wanted to access them using a service account. So not all users have to have access to those service accounts. So you can create those as a credential in the Azure Key Vault, and then use the Azure Key Vault connector directly in Power Automate to reference to those values and secrets, and then pass them to your next services and products to invoke that from the HTTP action. The same can be used for storing any credential and directly passing it through Power Automate to invoke any other service. And then there is playing around with the Azure Data. So right now, Power Automate directly supports the connector to the Azure storage blobs. So you can create, delete, list blobs, and do a lot more things with that. Apart from that, there is this Azure SQL connector. So you can directly connect to your SQL Service databases and SQL Server databases, and then create tables in them, perform CRUD operations, run stored procedures, and get data from there, and do a lot other things using the connectors. And then there is one other important part that I missed on the slide, which is the Graph API. So using Graph API, you can access all the Microsoft 365 services to which you don't have direct actions or direct connectors in Power Automate. To access the Microsoft Graph API, again, you can use the Azure Active Directory integration, where you can create a resource over there, and then allocate certain permissions to the resource or to the app, allocate app permissions to that registration that you make in the Active Directory. And using that, you can authenticate the Graph API in Power Automate, and then invoke actions to the Microsoft 365 services. One such example is like, let's say we have the Planner connector. So you can create tasks, you can list plans, you can associate a task to a plan, but you cannot create a plan directly right now using the Planner connector. So you can use the Graph API, which gets its authentication from the Azure Active Directory, and then create a plan using a custom connector by creating a custom connector, or using an HTTP action by directly invoking the Graph API. So there are a bunch of actions which are not supported directly, even though the connectors are there. So to overcome that limitation, you can use the Graph API using the Azure integration, and then perform those actions in Power Automate. So this was a high-level overview about the items that can be done with the Azure services and Power Automate, and you can leverage Power Automate to perform all these actions based on data coming around from different connectors. Now let's see how Azure Resource Manager fits into the picture, and how we can better use it along with Power Automate to achieve an end-to-end automation. So basically, there are 3 demos in this session that I'll be walking you through. The first one is how you can perform an action on an Azure virtual machine based on an email that arrives. So for example, a hypothetical scenario would be like a virtual machine sits in front of a service, and then the service is supposed to run for 24 hours. And if there's an issue that is being observed, an email is sent to us, a shared mailbox or a company help desk, saying that, okay, there's some issue with this particular virtual machine or with this particular service, and there is some action that needs to be taken by some team on that. So using the latest Azure Virtual Machine connector that has been deployed, we can use that, and we can identify the virtual machine and maybe restart it, or if it's behaving in an abnormal way, we can stop it, and let's see how we can do that. So I hope you're able to see the demo recording over here on the screen.
Yes, Yash.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so I'll walk through the flows a little later and show them in live, but these are recorded demos that I'm going to run through. The first one is where we are triggering this flow when an email is arriving, and the subject filter over here is action required. So we can filter this email. We can filter the flow to trigger when the subject of the email which is arriving contains action required. Similarly, it can be filtered based upon any particular email address that should be sending emails to this mailbox, and then triggering the flow. So once this email arrives, we are getting the name of the virtual machine from the email, from the subject of the email, where we are sending, okay, this particular virtual machine is facing some issues, and that needs to be checked. Then what we are doing is we are adding this start and wait for an approval action. And this approval action has custom options to which a user can respond to. So this mail is probably being sent to a manager or a dev team stating that, okay, this resource is not behaving properly, and there's some action that needs to be taken. Once the person responds to this approval, then the flow moves further with the consecutive actions. In a general approval action, you can add approve or reject as the choices to be provided to a user, or else you can use the custom responses and wait for a single response from the team stating that, okay, go ahead and restart this virtual machine, or just stop the virtual machine and wait until the team is debugging the issue. So we have this approval which will run and send this title stating that, okay, a particular response is required for this VM, and in the details we are passing the name of the virtual machine and stating that, okay, there's some issue with this, and assigning it to a particular user. So in this demo, I'm assigning it to a particular user. You can always assign it to a particular team as well. Moving forward, we are seeing that, okay, once the approval has been responded to, we want to check the outcome. If it is equal to restart, then use the Azure virtual machine connector. So you directly have this action where you restart the virtual machine. You have to pass the subscription ID, the resource group, and then the name of the virtual machine in this action. The same goes with the power off virtual machine action, where you have to pass all these parameters. The outputs is basically the name of the virtual machine that we are getting from the subject filter of the email. And we have this flow in place right now. So let's go ahead and check this in action. So I'll go ahead and just drop in an email stating that, an action is required for this particular virtual machine by typing its name. This could be an event triggered from Azure itself stating that, okay, you've been running a script somewhere and that returns with metric saying that, okay, the CPU utilization or the CPU performance of this virtual machine is degrading. So you just go ahead and see what is happening with this. So it sends an email to the shared mailbox or the service desk. And I send this email, which will trigger off our flow. And here you can see we had the subject stating that, okay, action required. So it is now on the start and wait for an approval action. The previous email is over here on the inbox. And I'm stating that, okay, we don't want to restart this virtual machine. Just stop it for now. And for this demo purpose, I'm just stopping it because if I would restart, then I couldn't show it on Azure going back and stating that, okay, the virtual machine was restarted. So I'll perform this approval and say, okay, stop the virtual machine, and we'll come back to the flow here. On the condition, it is evaluating right now that the approval response was stopped. So it is going to invoke the action to stop the virtual machine and basically power it off. So here the subscription ID and the resource group were provided. Here is the virtual machine. I'll refresh this page to show the status has been stopped now. Right now you can see on the overview that it was running. So as you can see now, its status shows as stopped. So as a consecutive action, you can add an email action stating that, okay, the virtual machine operation has been performed and it is successful and the VM has been stopped. And if the team wants to take further action, they can directly take it from the portal or however the system is working over there. But in an overall this is how you can end-to-end automate using the Azure Virtual Machines action, which was recently released. And before this action was there, we were using the Azure Resource Manager action again, the Resource Manager connector to invoke this action using the REST API on a virtual machine. Any questions so far?
Hey, Yash, nothing on the chat right now.
All right, so I guess we can go ahead.
Isn't it similar to monitoring? I think there is some feature for monitoring the virtual machines.
So, I mean, if the monitoring the virtual machines is there as a feature, it would directly perform the action on that and not send an approval action. So an approval action would be an add-on feature from Power Automate. And apart from that, it's like you can add further consecutive actions storing that data as well, and have an email log of all the actions that were performed on the resource.
Yash, we have a different question as well. So
Okay.
how do you configure for different environments?
Different subscriptions or different environments?
Configuration based on prod and development environment.
You mean flows? Because
So I mean that's what. Hey Yogesh, if you can unmute your mic and ask the question.
So we have to, if we have to take this infrastructure, entire infrastructure into from, let's say we have a dev VM and we have a prod VM, right? And we have to probably, do something about sometimes for the dev. So if we have to move this entire, deployment, right, from dev to prod or to QA, right? So is there some configuration somewhere we can do that?
So as you have seen, I've just directly passed the name of the virtual machine, and I have selected the subscription ID as a hard-coded value. And the same thing was for the resource group. I'll just go back to the flow and show it to you. I hope you can see the flow screen here.
Yes, we can see the flow screen.
All right. So if I knew on which subscription, for example, if it is for a, let's take two environments over here, a prod environment and a non-prod environment. On a non-prod environment, it's usually not that strict, and you can directly go ahead and restart the virtual machine by passing the parameters. But if it was a prod environment, I can still use the Azure Resource Manager connector. And do this list subscriptions action, where I identify the prod subscription with any, with a particular, maybe a particular subscription ID or a particular name, or let's say prod subscription and so and so. Once I list that and identify which subscription it is, over here on the restart virtual machine, I can pass a custom value, which would be the value of the subscription ID over here. So once I have the subscription ID, the same action, which is the Azure Resource Manager connector, can be used to list the resource groups in that particular subscription. So we can all parameterize all of that. Right now, it was very, for the demo purpose, I just use hard-coded values. You can parameterize each single of those and add the resource group as a parameterized value. And we are already passing the virtual machine name from the trigger of the email. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so we
Yes,
have
it does.
one. Okay, thanks, Yogesh. So the other question is SMS service also available in Power Automate?
So SMS service is not directly available. You'll have to use connectors like Twilio to send out SMS messages. And there's a hack as well, but that does not work on Indian phone numbers, or if it was like a US phone number, usually what they have is you type the phone number at the rate and the provider. So if it was like a Verizon mobile number, so phone number at the rate verizon.net would be an email address which you can use and send an email that will send the text or the body of the email as a SMS to the user, but that's not supported on Indian phone numbers. So you'll have to use external services like Twilio or some other APIs.
I hope that answers your question, Vikar. Let us know like if it's not answered and you need
Yes.
further information. And the another question is, can be auto schedule of a VM start and stop every day at 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. using ARM?
Oh, definitely, yes, we can do that. I mean, that can be directly done in Azure itself, but if you wanted to add more actions over here and route data from somewhere on Power Automate, then you can just set a recurrence trigger and then add these actions for the virtual machine. So this would
I
be
hope your
this would be the
question is
primary action, which is list subscriptions. So this will list all the subscriptions that a particular user has access to. Here, there are multiple ways you can authenticate. Actually, I can use my credentials as a user, or I can use a service principal to authenticate. Once I'm authenticating using the service principal, whatever access that service principal has, the same accesses are replicated over here on the Power Automate actions.
okay. So we have one other question, Yash. Can we get DTUs and high utilization of any resource as a trigger? Example, send email if DTU goes to 90%.
So it's like I haven't really worked on that, but I believe there are action groups that can be created directly in Azure, and you won't need Power Automate for that. So based on an event trigger, you can send an email, and that email will trigger the flow. And if you wanted to do it on a recurrence basis, you can still use the Azure Resource Manager connector again, the same connector that is over here, which we are using for list subscriptions. There is the entire API reference, which you can use to pull over metrics of any resource and check on a continual basis if for the DTU or for the CPU utilization and things like that.
I hope your question is answered, Mayur. Okay. Please go ahead, Yash.
All right. So let's go to the next part where we'll see how we can now actually deploy Azure resources using ARM templates. So let's see the demo directly. Now, first, let me show you. Yeah. So to the viewers who are unaware of what ARM templates are, let me just quickly go through the schema for the same. So an ARM template is basically a JSON script that you can use to deploy resources in Azure. It's infrastructure as code. There are two parts of to an ARM template. First one, which is the resource template. The second one is a parameter template. The parameter template is not a required one, but the resource template is the one which is required. So on the top of the screen over here, as we can see, I have a schema defined, and then the parameters for this particular template are defined. So this template that you're seeing on the screen is for a storage account, a simple storage account to be deployed in Azure. And here we have the parameter types that we can define. I have defined the parameters as a storage account type and defined a default value for that. So if a parameter file is not provided, it is going to create the standard LRS type storage account by default for me. And if not, if I'm trying to provide any parameters, the allowed values are these: the standard LRS, GRS, and ZRS, and then the premium LRS. And then I'm adding the metadata, which is the storage account type. And here I'm also adding the location of the storage account that I want. And the default value that is being provided is the location of the resource group in which this template is going to be deployed, or in which the storage account is going to be deployed. And then I have a variable over here for the storage account name because I don't want to hard code it. So I have taken a unique string from the resource group ID, and I'm concatenating it with store as a prefix so that it creates a unique storage account name for me. And finally, the resources part of the template, where I define the type of the Azure resource, which is a storage account, and provide the required values, which are the API versions, the name which comes from the variable, and the location that comes from the parameters, and again the SKU, which is which type of storage account do I want to deploy. That again comes from the parameters. And then finally, at the end, I have the outputs defined for the storage account, which is the storage account name. And that again is coming from the variables of my script over here. So this is a basic script and for deploying a storage account in Azure. Now let's go back and run through our demo. So this demo basically is focusing upon, we get multiple requests. So let's say if a new employee or if a new project has been onboarded in a company and there are a certain set of Azure resources which are required and those need to be deployed. So a person creates a request ticket from their request portal stating that, okay, this is the Azure resource that is required. And let's say if they're using a Power App and the details are being stored on a SharePoint list. So another user who is the admin approves or rejects these requests and can directly hit the deploy button from Power Apps and initiate a deployment for the resource in Azure. So let's take a look at that step by step. We have this flow which is going to be triggered from a Power Apps control. I'm initializing a variable to get the type of resource. So as you can see, this is a small basic Power App again, which is sitting on the top of a SharePoint list, where I have a gallery or a control where I'm displaying the request created by person name and what kind of resource they have requested and the approve button. So if I click the approve button, it is going to hit the flow and directly start deploying the template. So this is our SharePoint list where all the requests from users get created. And here on the flow, we are taking the type of the resource deployment that needs to be done. So for this demo purpose, again, a storage account is a type of a resource which gets deployed real quick. So we are taking that one for an example. And I'm checking if the type of the resource is a storage account in a condition. If you had multiple types like a virtual machine or like any other API or a web app that needs to be deployed, so you can add a switch case condition and pass those individual values over there. It gets it from Power Apps, and you can have individual actions configured for each case or each resource type. So for now, we just have a storage account, and we are using this action from the Azure Resource Manager connector, which is called as validator template deployment. So to folks who are not available, who are not aware of the process of deploying an Azure ARM template, what happens is when you initiate a deployment, so first the first thing it does is it validates your template and says that, okay, everything is in order and everything is proper. And this looks like a valid resource, can be deployed in the resource group. So basic validation tests are done such that, if the JSON is structured correctly or not. And let's say in the case of storage accounts, if the name of the storage account that we're trying to create from the template already exists in a resource group or not, and things like that. So it is going to validate all of those and send out with a result stating that, okay, the template validation has been succeeded or failed. So for this action, again, we are providing the parameters. I'm hard coding the values over here. So I'm providing a subscription, a resource group, and then I'm providing a deployment name, which is deployment one. And on
Hey,
the yep.
sorry to stop you there. We have a question. So if we manually create a storage account in Azure and then use ARM to deploy the storage with the same name and within the same resource, does it update the same storage account?
Provided the deployment mode is incremental, or else it is going to fail, I believe.
Okay. So does that answer your question, Yogesh?
Well, I was just coming to that part again. So after providing these three parameters at the top, I'm providing the template URI, which is an accessible resource, accessible URL from which the action can get the JSON content and the JSON script. So once I provide the template URI, I can also provide a parameters URI that I was just talking about, but it's not a compulsory requirement here. And then I have chosen the deployment mode as incremental. So it is going to check if the resource is already there in Azure, and if it is, then if it can deploy an incremental mode on that, and if the Azure resource can be updated, it is going to update it. So this was about validating the template deployment part. Now that we are validating the template, we want to check if the template validation was successful or not. So I'll quickly skip this part of the template explanation that we just did. And come back here. So as you can see, after the action that was to validate a template deployment, I'm checking if the provision of the template validation has succeeded or not. And I'm in the yes branch, I'm adding the other set of actions. On the no branch, always if it was a production flow, you can add an action to create a ticket in Azure Devops or send an email to the respective team stating that the template validation has failed and they need to update their template. So once it is succeeded, I'm submitting a template deployment over here using the ARM connector. And I'm selecting all those subscription resource group and deployment from the previous action. And again, providing the template URI as well. Now, the interesting parameters over here or the options over here are the deployment mode again is being set as incremental. And then wait for deployment has been set to no, because I just want to submit this deployment and I'm going to add another action to see that if the previous deployment has succeeded or not. You can set this to yes if you wanted to do it in the same action. So here I'm seeing that read a template deployment. So in the previous action, when we are submitting the deployment template after it has been validated, Azure, it starts the resource deployment gets started. And this action is going to wait until the deployment is complete, be it successful or failed, and return a result to us. So I've provided the subscription resource group and name from the previous action. Now I want to, after reading the template deployment, I want to check the outputs of the deployment. So for every resource type, the outputs could differ based on the template, based on the ARM template that you are configuring. In our template, we just had one output of type name. We wanted to send the name of the storage account to the as the output of the template deployment. If you're adding more details such as the name of the resource group, the location, and all those details, you'll have to construct the parse JSON schema accordingly and to access all the individual key values in the consecutive actions. So in this case, we just want to access the name of the storage account and send it back to our Power App. And I add the action, which is respond to a Power App or flow and send back the name of the storage account that was created. So let's quickly see this in action. I have the Azure resource. I have an Azure subscription open over here, and I'm going to start a template deployment. So once I hit approve, it is going to trigger the flow. I mean, a storage account is the one which takes the least time, I believe, for the deployment to complete. And as the deployment has completed, it has returned to with the name of the storage account that it created. So as you can see on the screen, there is a pop-up that has come on the Canvas app with the name of the storage account. So for the purpose of this demo, I have just printed it over there. You can see the first prefix, which is store, and then the string which is coming from the resource group ID. And if I go to the deployments tab over here, I should be able to see my deployments which have been succeeded. So as you can see, the name of the deployment one that we passed from Power Automate, and then our storage account, which has successfully deployed on this resource group. Now let's check the flow run history real quick to see what all outputs that it has provided us with. So the trigger was Power Apps, and in the condition, we've seen that it was a storage account type. And then we initiated a validation for the template deployment. Once the deployment was successful, we had this create deployment action where it is going to submit the deployment to Azure and start deploying the resource for us. All right, so here, as you can see in the previous action, I'll go back to the Azure portal and show it back to you that the resource group location and how it picked up the same thing and deployed the resource for us. So this was about deploying a resource in Azure using the ARM template and Power Automate. Any questions on this so far?
Okay, so we have a question. How do we link this with Azure Devops?
So with Azure DevOps, I'll show it to you on real over here. So for example, over here, if the type is storage account and the validation for a template deployment has failed, I can add an action to directly connect to Azure DevOps connector. As you can see here, I don't have an org created on Azure DevOps right now to demo this, but you can create a work item and assign it to a particular team, which is a support team, stating that okay, the template deployment has failed, so there might be a bug in the template, or there might be a bug in the JSON script, so you need to fix that.
Yes, the question is more around how do we start the deployment process as part of our Azure DevOps, like whenever check-in is done or something, right? We want to deploy from Azure DevOps.
We have a bunch of triggers again for Azure DevOps. That is when a build is completed and when a code is checked in. So we can use this as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And again, so for items that are not available directly over here, and if the API supports it, you can create a custom connector or use the HTTP actions to do that.
True, yes. So I think Yogesh, your question is more for the CI/CD stuff, like kind of the one-click deployment. So if you just triggered a check-in in your solution, then it need to be deployed on the specific solutions or the specific servers, right?
I'm not sure of that one.
Yes,
yeah, so probably that is not the part of, if I'm not wrong, it's not part of this session. Like the session is already covered by Dharni. So you may refer the recordings later.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. I think Dharani is on the call. You can check with him, right? If Dharani, you are still on the call, and we did talk about that in the first session as investor.
Right. So I think Dharni left the call. It's probably
yeah, it's probably too late for him. Yeah, maybe. But you can get in touch with him. In this conversation, when the recordings are shared, you'll have the details. So he'll be the better person to answer that kind of a requirement.
All right. So may I proceed?
Yeah, please go ahead. There is one more question, Ritika, if you want to point it out to.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. So why not do the same using logic apps? What are the pros using a flow?
So pros using a flow, the first one is, I mean, we're not using any approval action over here. So flow support approvals and logic apps don't. And from the point of this particular flow, I'm triggering it from a Power Apps control. On a logic apps, I cannot use a Power App control to trigger a logic app.
Does that answer your question, Srina? Okay,
And I mean,
you can go ahead.
these were the pros of using flow over logic apps. Logic apps has their own pros over using flows. So it's just a matter of what works best for you.
You can
All
go
right.
ahead, Yash.
All right. Okay. All right. So this was about deploying resources. Now the last part that I wanted to show is how you can add tags to Azure resources. So I mean, we are creating so many. We've seen creating resources and deploying those to Azure. But let's say if there was a person on the team who has been creating resources, but then there's another person whose job is to monitor all of these Azure resources and then keep a check of those on a daily basis, have an automation script running and get the metrics of each of those resources. Tags make life much easier on that end. So let's see on a new flow of how we can create tags for the entire resource group just by the click over here. So in this one, I'm going to use a manually triggered flow, but the ideal one would be using a recurrence-based flow that keeps updating the tag for a particular resource group on a weekly basis, such that any resource that has been deployed to that gets the tag as well.
Hey Yash,
Yeah.
we have a question.
Okay.
So, cognitive services recognize text versus AI builder text recognize. In which scenario, which one should be used?
If you're having subscription to AI Builder, then definitely the AI Builder one. But it's like the text analytics of Azure resource. I think it provides the option to translate as well, which is currently not available in the AI Builder one. So it depends upon the use case and the scenario.
Does that answer your question, Naresh? Okay, yes, you can go ahead.
All right. I mean, there's a list of actions which are already available for this connector, the Azure Resource Manager connector. The ones which are not available, again, I repeat the same thing. You can use the API reference and use this particular action, which is invoke a resource operation. And there's a set of documentation. You can use every single API that is available over there on the resources which can be accessed and perform operations on those. But now let's just take a look at adding tags. So I'll use this action, which is update an existing group and select my subscription from the drop down. Let's say the Azure Resource Manager, and my resource group is in the East US. So let's quick check that one over here. So I have the resource group, which is the Azure Resource Manager resource group, and there's a bunch of resources created in this one in the location East US. So running this flow is going to update the existing resource group and add the tag, which is having the name as from flow and the value as verified. I think it has run successfully and added the tag to the entire resource group. So I'll just come and do a control F5 here. And as you can see, it has added the tag which is from flow as verified. Similarly, you can do it for individual resources in a resource group as well, or to the entire subscription if you wanted to add the tag that way. Any questions so far?
There is nothing on the chat. So if you have any questions, anyone, please feel free to write it.
Or maybe unmute and just ask.
So why do we need tags? We have a question.
Why do we need tags? It can be a bunch of reasons, primarily monitoring something. So if I were using a external monitoring tool, for example, there's a bunch of tools right now that provide monitoring virtual machines and networks on a particular Azure resource group. And to monitor those, it is a requirement that you add a tag, and that is how the other tool references or accesses the resource group. And then it just monitors the resources which have that particular tag.
I hope your question is answered, Yogesh.
Yep.
Hello,
Thanks.
Yash.
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. Like, as a developer, I don't have access to go to Azure portal directly and do this stuff. But we have one app which is registered on the Azure and which has capability to do this stuff. So can we do all this stuff by using Graph APIs and by authenticating with that application which is registered on the Azure?
Not with the Graph API per se, but if the application is, if it is registered as a service principal account or something like that, then you can use the, you can add an HTTP action. And you can use the ARM API, ARM REST API, and then add those actions here
Okay.
and
Thanks.
pass. Yep.
Thank you.
So, for example, let's say, I here on this particular action, I directly authenticated using the using a service principal, because all the actions that I have used were already there on the connector, which is the Azure Resource Manager connector. But for example, if the action was not there and the API reference was not being directly used on the connector, I can log in from here using the HTTP action by entering the URL, which is login.microsoft.com, and provide the credentials as a part of the body, or I can do the Active Directory OAuth. So once you've registered an app in your Active Directory, you can pass these details and then log in. And on the next action, you can similarly add another action, which is an HTTP action again, and pass the authentication token that you received in this one to that, and further invoke the API.
Okay, so the authentication has to be done for one time only, right? After that, all the subsequent calls, I can do it with respect to token.
Yes, yes. As long as that particular user or the principal that you're accessing or authenticating here has access to those resources.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
And in a situation where it's like you cannot access the ARM connector, as you just said, and there's an app that is registered over there, you can create a custom connector over here for, let's say, limited, if you had limited number of actions which were like just adding tags. So you can use that specific API and create a action in the custom connector stating that, okay, I just want to invoke the API to add tags. So you can then add it as a direct action over here, and it authenticates based on the user who's logged in.
Okay.
If that's not very confusing.
Got it.
Yes, we have a few more questions.
Yep.
So can we perform action on assigning resources, permissions, and policies? That is something like adding or removing resources based on business needs.
I haven't tried that out yet. I'm not sure on that one.
Okay. So the next one is like, how stable is Flow? Can Flow be implemented on enterprise applications for integration using custom connectors?
I mean, yes, definitely. It's like the first flow or the second one, basically, where I have showed the deployment. That is one of the flows which we are using in production environment and deploying I mean, a bunch of resources on a daily basis. So it's pretty much reliable that way.
Also, there is one other question. Can we be able to define multi-level approvals in Flow?
Yes, we can. So
Okay.
approvals, again, it's I mean, not a part of this session, but you can define multi-level approvals. And recently, I have also published a post where you can have multi-line approvals using adaptive cards, Outlook, Teams, and whatnot.
Okay.
All
And
right.
one other is like, can we perform post HTTP action which is hosted on third-party website?
Yes, we can. So the one HTTP action over here that you are seeing, or do you mean, I mean, accessing the website and then performing the action, or just directly calling it over here so that it hits the service or the website?
Hey Vikar, if you can unmute your mic and tell the requirement, maybe I shall be able to help you better. Just hit the service, he says.
No, just hit the service is this HTTP action on the screen right now.
Okay.
You can select the method. It supports posts get, put, patch, and delete.
Does that answer your question, Vikar?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And the other question is how to monitor flow deployed at enterprise level. Is there any dashboard available for admins to monitor all flows deployed by various users?
So what you can do is, I mean, there are a lot of answers to that one. The ideal way would be using the COE kit, but there's one more thing that you can do, which is analytics. So as an admin, you can use the flow admin connector and get all the flows on a Power App and create a dashboard over there to see who's creating what flows and what's happening where. And then there is this analytics, which is on the screen where you can see total number of runs of a flow. You can see errors and all those details. It gets updated in a while. So this was last updated today at 3:30 p.m. So once this updates, you'll be able to see the flow run trend, total runs, number of runs, and then what actions have errored out and all those details.
Uh, and
Uh,
also one other is there.
yeah,
Are we able to integrate flow with Power BI?
Flow with Power BI. So it's like if you wanted to call Power BI actions in Flow, there are some available, and for the others, you can use the API. If you're referring to calling a flow from a Power BI report, I am unaware of that yet.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Kamal? Okay. You can go ahead.
All right, that were some good questions. And I had one other demo, but we have too little time, so I will not be able to complete it in this much time. So I would open the floor for more questions as the audience would want to ask, and put up the end screen over here where you can please provide your valuable feedback. Join the Kaizala group and the LinkedIn group for the D365 champs.
Yes, one question here.
Yes.
So let's say we are using the Terraform scripts for creating the Azure resources. So do you mean that we can do all the same using these Power Automate?
I mean, yes. So it's like if let's say, I mean, in Azure ARM templates, we can just create the new type resources. You cannot create classic type VMs and all that. So if that is what you're referring to, but if you're using the ARM API or the REST actions, you can definitely do that from Power Automate. I haven't used Terraform, so I'm really unaware of that.
Thank you. Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have one other question, Yash.
Mhm.
Can we configure Power Apps connection during deployment to another tenant?
We cannot.
Okay.
So it's like the connection is already created, and then uh, you are performing those actions. So if you're deploying it to another tenant, so after deployment only you can go and change those actions. I think it was pointed out as a part of the CI/CD deployments with the Power Apps tools, but I'm not entirely sure on how it is right now or what it looks like right now.
Okay. And we have another. Can we call PowerShell scripts using Flow?
Not directly. There's no action that is going to directly call a PowerShell script. Two ways we can do that. One is using the Azure Automation account. You can create an Azure Automation resource in Azure and call a PowerShell script from there. So there's a connector in Power Automate that can connect to the Azure Automation resource. And the second one is running a UI flow.
Does that answer your question, Mayur? Okay. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Yash.
Thank you.